Hi, everyone. I'm David Wheeler, the Executive Director of Conserve Wildlife Foundation, and I'm so excited to speak to you tonight about climate change and its impacts on wildlife here in New Jersey and beyond. I wanted to start with a note that would probably hit home for many of you. Just around 8 years ago, uh, this month, Hurricane Sandy swept, of course, up the seaboard and hit New Jersey head on, and we're all too familiar with the human toll of that storm in New Jersey and in many of the surrounding states. But one of the sides of it that received much less attention, understandably, but nonetheless was still incredibly impactful, was its impact on the wildlife world. And in particular, right here in Cape May, on the western side of Cape May along the Delaware Bay shore, in Cape May and Cumberland counties in particular, Hurricane Sandy did incredible, untold damage and nearly wiped out one of the signature wildlife spectacles in the whole world. And the way that occurred is by wiping out most of those beaches along the Delaware Bay shore. The superstorm put the very existence of horseshoe crabs and many of the shorebirds that depend on horseshoe crab eggs put their existence very much at risk. And for those of you not familiar, a bit of context: horseshoe crabs are one of the most ancient creatures we have still roaming the earth today, more or less unchanged since the ages of the dinosaurs, and even prior to that. Horseshoe crabs have been swimming our waters in great numbers as far back as we uh, can study. And horseshoe crabs descend in the month of May. You get huge amounts of horseshoe crabs spawning along the Delaware Bay shore, and they can be found up and down the New Jersey coast and many other states along the eastern seaboard. But really, Delaware Bay is the pinnacle for this activity. As a result, we have shorebirds like the red knot that you see here, flying from as far away as the southern tip of South America, just north of Antarctica, flying all the way here to New Jersey. It's an incredible journey. It's really a globally significant journey that red knots and ruddy turnstones and other birds do to get here for one reason only. They spend around 3 to 4 weeks total. Each bird may be spending around a week here at Delaware Bay feasting on horseshoe crab eggs. It's this very timely migration that is completely dependent on those horseshoe crab eggs. Without the eggs, the birds would not have enough energy to do the second leg of their journey. It's not enough to fly all the way from furthest South America up to New Jersey, but then they have to complete their journey by flying up to the Arctic to find nesting grounds in the summer and raise the next generation of shorebirds. It's an incredible spectacle. Some of these birds will fly over 9,000 miles. Um, we have a bird that was nicknamed Moonbird because we had banded it each year through our work, and this bird had flown the same distance as flying to the moon and back over the course of its life. Now, this is a relatively small bird, the size of a robin. Uh, it's kind of, if you saw it, you'd say, oh, that's a pretty bird. Maybe you wouldn't be knocked out. But think about that. That one individual bird is flying the distance of the moon. Such an incredible journey. And nonetheless, all of this takes place every year in Delaware Bay. Now, how does this fit in with climate change? Well, of course, Hurricane Sandy, when it swept through, in addition to knocking out so much of our day-to-day lives along the coast in New Jersey, well, it also wiped out those beaches. And the horseshoe crabs, had groups like ours, Conserve Wildlife Foundation, and many of our partners, not quickly mobilized to rebuild those beaches, those horseshoe crabs would not have had a place to spawn, and all those shorebirds we may have lost entirely. And this was, as many of you may remember from the coverage at the time, Hurricane Sandy. While you can never pinpoint, as with any storm, you can't say that's exactly because of climate change. What you can say is that so much of its damage was exacerbated because of climate change. What we're going to do over the next 45 minutes or so is take a look at some of those impacts of climate change, whether it's causing it directly or in many cases worsening other damage and other impacts to wildlife, and of course to people as well, both indirectly and directly. And just to bring that story full circle, I mentioned our groups and others rebuilding the Delaware Bay shore. We rebuilt over 5 beaches in time for that seasonal migration that coming May of 2013, and we were able to remove thousands of tons of rubble. It was just a tremendous mobilization made possible by a combination of foundations and nonprofits, different agencies, state and federal and local, all working together, and companies as well, all working together to make that happen, and essentially to save a number of species that we might have lost entirely otherwise. But climate change was really what worsened all those impacts we saw from Hurricane Sandy, including to Delaware Bay. And this is a good segue into a brief overview of our organization's work, Conserve Wildlife Foundation. As you can see in some of these pictures, we are a nonprofit that works to protect rare and at-risk wildlife, and we have been doing this for the past 20 years. Most of our work takes place in New Jersey, although we do work far beyond. And the connected side of that is everything that we do with engaging the public in talks like this one tonight, and also in providing education, both in school and out of school, field trips as well, throughout the state. And of course, in times like now, most of that education is taking place virtually, as you might expect. One quick note, our work in the field, however, has fortunately been able to move forward with some impacts, of course, but we're fortunate in that most of our projects have been able to continue close to what they were before COVID. So for that, we're thankful. A few words about myself. As I mentioned, I'm the executive director at Conserve Wildlife Foundation. I also spent 8 years teaching environmental communications at Rutgers School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. And I also wrote the book Wild New Jersey: Nature Adventures in the Garden State, where I was able to visit and join so many of the state's top naturalists and wildlife leaders in doing what they do to protect and help restore wildlife across New Jersey. And so this year, it's obviously been pretty different from anything we've ever experienced. And I love this cartoon. It gives, if you took an outsider perspective, say of a polar bear, realizing that all of a sudden they see that everything has changed dramatically in society, but of course it wasn't because of climate change. And it's one of those sadly ironic jokes in the sense that it's all too true. Another spin on that you see here is that getting over this COVID hump, at whatever point we do finally accomplish that, which will be some time. As massive as it's been for us, there's the concern that, well, what lies in store with climate change? And it's my hope, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of this today, that some of the lessons we've learned from COVID are lessons that we can also bring to the fight against climate change and the fight for resiliency and preparedness among our society. So first off, a bit about, well, climate change. What makes it so challenging? What makes it such a big challenge for us as a society to fight before we even get into the wildlife elements of it? Well, a few things. One is it's incredibly complex. It's has so many different causes. It has so many different impacts that are not necessarily easy to measure. In many cases, they have to be measured over extensive periods of time, then compared to other periods of time, and a lot of room for discussion and debate among the nuances there. There's also, there's no one easy solution. It's not like we just do this one thing and we can resolve or address climate change. It's much more complicated than that. There's a whole plethora of steps that people need to take. And it's not something that one group can do. It's not a state or a national problem. It's a global problem. So you have all these moving pieces, and then to top it off, its time scale is not only challenging in the sense that you're measuring change that's mostly incremental, and that's taken place over a large period of time, but the solutions process itself is something that takes place in this year of all years. You can relate. It takes place in much larger time frames than the typical 4 or 2 year electoral cycle, depending on the position, or even 6 year for governors. It's not something that just gets, or for senators rather, it's not something that just can be addressed. Oh, we're going to make this our signature uh, topic that our campaign and our governance will take on, and then we'll fix it by the time we leave. You can do that with a lot of problems. You can't do that with climate change. As a result, as a priority, it's certainly got much less attention from the powers that be, from elected officials, than it would if there was an easier answer and an easier kind of a set of solutions that could be addressed in that shorter time frame. So I say all this not to get anyone off the hook, but rather simply to point out it's nothing like anything we've faced before as a society, and it will take so many moving pieces. And now translating that to the wildlife arena, those impacts are just as complicated and complex when they impact wildlife. However, just like in the case of Superstorm Sandy, there's ways that we're seeing it in impacting wildlife as well. We're seeing those impacts take place. In many cases, it's little by little, and then all of a sudden, you've seen this massive shift. We're going to talk a lot about that, and those are shifts in everything from habitat to ranges to competition among different species to threats from invasive species and disease and other threats that are exacerbated by climate change, as well as more direct impacts. Temperatures warming of air, of water, the prey changing, the predators changing. Everything is now in a state of flux, much more than it had been, and we're going to get to see a lot of that. And one of the easiest ways to picture how all this changes is each spring. If you've noticed even anecdotally noticed over the years, spring seems to be coming earlier. Winters seem to be, it's constantly, each year is different, of course, but generally winters seem to be different than they were a few decades ago. We're having many more winters where there's much more rain than snow. We still have our winters that are plenty of snow and great for skiing, but much more often now we're getting rain instead of snow and through much of New Jersey. Things are greening up much earlier than they had been. We're seeing a lot of the flowering of our flowers, our trees, everything blooming and greening. They're saying roughly about a half day a year. It's pushing forward. Well, what's a half day? What does that matter, right? Well, a half day in and of itself isn't a big deal. A half day over a decade, now you're talking around a week, right? Now, give or take. A half day over a few decades, you're getting close to a month. And now shifting the entire spring cycle forward by 3-4 weeks, close to a month, is a very different ballgame than a half a day in and of itself. All of a sudden now, as this shift has occurred, you're seeing the impacts to wildlife species now play out in real time. And let's just look at some of the ways in which spring shows itself. Well, first, of course, the frost has to recede. We have to get past that late winter. Usually sometime in March, where there's that one point where we all say, okay, I think we're out of winter now. I think we've turned the corner. So frost has to recede. When that happens, that's when that greening and blooming that I mentioned starts to play out. Of course, intricately timed to that, the caterpillars, they hatch, they start feasting on the leaves. Well, they can keep up with that time change because they're basically right there on the tree. And so the pollinators that then emerge from the caterpillars, that kind of follows suit. But where we see it most impacting is all those creatures that depend on those that aren't necessarily there all along, that can't keep pace with the time. When you look at migrating birds, I mentioned the red knot, and that's of course a shorebird. It's a little different than some of the birds that would be most impacted in what we're talking about here, with caterpillars and pollinators. But these migratory birds also are flying from far away. Neotropical migrants fly from usually anywhere from the Caribbean down to the tropics. So you're talking Brazil, you're talking Northern South America, and you're talking the whole Caribbean region. And they fly up to here, up to New Jersey, and other places around the East Coast. And they don't know exactly what the timing is going to be like up here when they leave the jungles of Paraguay. Uh, they know what the length of the days are like there, and that's one of the things that triggers them to leave. They don't have that forecast ahead. They don't have weather.com for neotropical migrants that gives them that heads up. Here's what's coming. I should hold off a week, or I should get my stuff together much sooner. We got to leave early. They don't have that, and so again, in any given year, maybe there's the ability to navigate that and to kind of make do. But when you play this out over many years and you continue to see that trend, all of a sudden, everything that had been timed ideally, that they would arrive, they would have that, depending on the bird species, they would have that abundance of insects to eat, or they would have different seeds and nuts and whatever plants, depending on the bird. All those things now are very different. And so one of the areas where we've seen the biggest impacts is in these neotropical migrants, and a great way to picture that whole system, this whole system here, is picture it like a ballet. And we're getting close to the end of the year, so we could say the Nutcracker. You could go with Swan Lake, go with your own preference, but picture a ballet. Everything is so planned to the most minute detail. Each dancer is doing his or her own thing. You have the orchestra coming in at the exact certain moments. Each instrument has to come in. The set, the movement, everything is intricately choreographed. And all of a sudden, we've now changed from that beautiful ballet that can warm your hearts to one of those inflatable roadside uh, advertising gimmicks now seems to be conducting our wonderful wildlife and ecosystem ballet. And all of a sudden now we're entering into quite a bit of chaos, at least as far as a number of these species are concerned. And so the birds that are impacted the most, well, to put this into perspective, kind of what is the scope of what we're talking about here? Over modern recorded history in the Americas, we've lost around 9 species from North America, 3 of which we had good numbers here in New Jersey. The heath hen on the left, which one of its last holdouts was in the Pine Barrens. You also had the passenger pigeon, the Carolina parakeet. Both of these were birds that were incredibly common across America, and particularly along the East Coast. And you can find them in great numbers in New Jersey. We did lose them for a number of different reasons. But again, the key number there for our purposes is 9. We lost 9 species. To put that into perspective, now there's roughly 600 or so North American species of birds. And we're right now at risk of losing nearly 400 of them are at risk of being lost over the next 50 years. So first of all, it's close to 2/3. But again, to compare that, we've lost 9, and each one of those was a tragedy. But now we're looking in the hundreds, potentially up to 300 are clearly at risk now as we look forward and as we see the trends and the changes occurring. To give you a few examples here, American tree swallow, this is on the top left. This is a bird that its egg laying has had to shift earlier and earlier each spring. You've also seen impacts on rose-breasted grosbeak on the bottom left, scarlet tanager on the top right, indigo bunting on the bottom right. These are all birds that are among the dozen or so neotropical migrants that are relatively common and yet are showing those signs of being impacted. The middle bird is a little different. It's a neotropical migrant, but it's already been drastically impacted. The golden wing warbler, we've already seen a massive, massive decline in this bird. And now factoring in climate change moving forward, this is kind of one of those signature species for what we risk to lose. If you look at it as kind of an accelerated look forward, this bird is unfortunately very much ahead of this negative curve that the other birds potentially could be headed towards in the upcoming decades. And so the golden winged warbler is one that is one of our most at-risk birds, and right now its lone holdout in New Jersey is really the northwest remote um, areas of different forest and young forest in particular that the warblers depend on. And it also, even one of our truly signature species, our state bird, the American goldfinch, with just a few more degrees in temperatures warming, it could lose up to 2/3 of its range. And on many of these birds, you're seeing, as we'll see with a lot of other wildlife as well, you're seeing their range contracting and shifting north to try to keep pace. And for many birds and wildlife species, the big question comes down to, can they keep up with all the changes of climate change? And as those changes start to speed up, the challenge becomes that much more uh, daunting for so many of these birds. I mentioned the different, pollinators, and to give you a few examples, the monarch is one that is, again, like many pollinators, unfortunately. Many of our butterflies and bees and moths are in rapid decline. Um, and the reasons are not only climate change at all, but they very much are being exacerbated by climate change. And so, again, one of the common trends we'll see over the course of today is that so many of the species that are most at risk are those that are, let's say, most at risk of climate change are those that have already seen kind of a population drop and decline. They've already they've already seen maybe their range limited, and it could be because of development, it could be habitat destruction, it could be impacts of invasive species, et cetera. But they've already seen kind of their range decline. They don't necessarily have. Some species can just move north. Many others can't. Many other species can't move north because maybe the habitat they depend on more or less stops, maybe because of development or because of other different ecosystems. That just, there's a limit to what they can do. And so that is these are huge threats for many pollinators. Bees, you have many of the colony collapse disorder already, again, impacting bees all around the world, and which I'll come back to later. The impacts are not just great to pollinators, but they're massive for the birds and other wildlife that depend on pollinators directly as food, but also our entire ecosystems that depend on pollinators doing their job to keep everything running smoothly. And lastly, of course, we don't want to neglect their impact on us directly through all the food we eat. Another group of species that depends on pollinators in multiple ways, and particularly in this case that we're talking about as food, are bats. Of course, bats use their sonar to find prey, and flying insects are a great big part of that. Of course, that would include moths, beetles, bees, butterflies, so many flying species, many of which are pollinators. So that's one way, as they're declining, bats are being impacted. Bats are also, however, facing threats from climate change because of because in many cases, as we see the drop in insects, we're seeing bats then kind of follow suit. Bats are in New Jersey, some of our most endangered species in recent years are species like little brown bat and northern long-eared bat, whose populations have plummeted. And well, they plummeted because of an introduced fungus called white nose syndrome. Uh, Climate change now puts them more at risk. One of the things that happens with bats is if you've ever gone out on a late winter day, maybe you get at one of those really warm February days. It's pushing 60. You're feeling, oh, this is great. We got a nice little break from all the cold. Well, you get a few days like that strung in a row, and you might very well see a bat or two flying around late in the day. And that's bad news, because that means when it gets cold again in the next couple of days, the bat just wasted all that energy and was itself at risk of flying around, using its energy, not catching insects because it's too soon for the insects, And so there's a much greater chance now that bat doesn't survive the actual winter when you have these kind of fall spring days, particularly in increasing numbers like we've seen in recent years. So one of the ways that bats are at risk, in addition to the loss of their prey as pollinators continue to decline. I mentioned about habitats moving and the ranges of many of these species moving. This is a somewhat, I'm not going to get into a bunch of complicated charts and maps here, but the basic uh, way to think about it is as temperatures increase, the wildlife species that depend on those temperature ranges, they have to move one way or the other. They have to move either north to keep up with to continue to find that temperature range they depended on, or they have to move to higher elevations. That's not as big a deal here in New Jersey as you get in some of the more mountainous areas of the globe, but that's the other option. Unfortunately, many of our species are so dependent, and this is now looking at kind of the bigger picture beyond New Jersey. Many of those species are so dependent on certain mountain ranges or certain isolated landscapes that there's no further they can go. And so those are the species as at risk as just about any in the world. In New Jersey, some of those species, I mentioned about the golden wing warbler living in that kind of more remote and rugged northwest part of the state. You see that with some of our mammals too. The fisher, that gorgeous creature on the top, the porcupine on the bottom right. These are species you only find in the northwest part of the state. To a lesser extent, bobcat you mostly find there as well. And as temperatures continue to warm in New Jersey and elsewhere, these species are more likely to continue moving north. And so we're very much at risk of losing these species over time, even though they're both healthy right now in terms of their populations in Northwest Jersey, as is the bobcat. We do see the overall trend heading in that direction. Grassland birds is another one. Grassland birds are some of the biggest at-risk species in the country. And if you think about it, why? It makes sense. Well, our farmland in New Jersey and across the country has increasingly been lost over the past 100 years in particular, as we've gone to a much more kind of industrial kind of farming. And so many of those small farms that filled New Jersey's landscape, the Garden State, a century ago, have reverted to forest, have been cleared for housing developments and strip malls, and grassland birds now have a much dwindling range now, or habitat that they can find here in New Jersey. And now you get the warming temperatures, and that's going to be, they're going to be another group that's going to have to either move north if they can find the habitat, or potentially start to see even greater declines to what we've already seen. And birds like the bobolink in the bottom left, and then the grasshopper sparrow, the vesper sparrow, and then birds that depend on them like the American kestrel. And it's not relegated to land animals or to birds either. We're seeing this inland in some of our waters with the brook trout, the top left image, and the lake trout. Those are fish that depend on a range that runs from, say, 50 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The water temperatures have to be within that range, or it just gets too hot for them. And we're seeing major temperature increases in our inland waterways, in addition to the ocean, which I'll come to in a moment. We're seeing major temperature increases, and species like the brook trout, New Jersey state fish, are very much at risk of being lost if all the lakes and reservoirs and streams that they depend on continue to warm. Instead, and it's not bad for everybody, unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say. Fortunately for the specific species, although unfortunate for the actual biodiversity as a whole, you do have some species that prefer the warmer temperature. So, like, for instance, carp you see on the bottom right, largemouth bass. These are fish that can handle the warmer temperature, and so as a result, they've been going increasingly north. They've been found more and more north than they had been just a couple decades ago. The ocean and the Arctic are two other areas that we're really seeing major impacts. And well, how does this impact New Jersey? Uh, because many of these species move back and forth between the two. So, like all those species that we deal with, very few of them stop at the state border. For the most part, they move quite widely. Seals, we have four different seal species in New Jersey that you see regularly each winter, and a number of these species, um, you'll you'll start to see impacts because as sea ice melts, much of the sea ice, year-round sea ice, will be gone in the next few decades. And seals are among the animals that depend, along with polar bears and a couple others, depend on that as much as any creatures do. And so they're certainly at risk for that. Um, uh, Not all the seals we get depend on sea ice, but many of them do. Here you see, just for your own reference, that's a group of seals right at Sandy Hook here in New Jersey. And of course, you can see them in Cape May as well in the winter. So something to keep an eye out for this coming winter if you have the chance to get out to one of the beaches. Snowy owls, another one that, as well as the ruddy turnstone in the bottom left. These are birds that um, depend on the Arctic temperatures and the whole Arctic habitat and ecosystem and prey structure. And as that starts to change, these birds are going to be impacted in very different ways. Um, One of the paradoxical elements of climate change and what has often been referred to as global warming, but in this case, it's not global warming. It truly is the climate change. Is as the impacts are starting to be seen. The worry is that over time the jet stream gets impacted, and much of the Arctic system gets kind of locked in place. And paradoxically, instead of that meaning warming the Arctic, there may be uh, there may be quite a bit of that, and certainly with the sea ice, we're seeing that. But there will also be kind of these um, winter blasts that may prevent the ground from thawing and permafrost being impacted. And what does that mean for the tundra? It means the creatures that, for instance, the snowy owl depends on, or that the ruddy turnstone and red knots and other shorebirds depend on when they get to their Arctic summering grounds. Those species, those insects, in the case of those birds, or the snowshoe hare and ptarmigan and different voles for the snowy owl, those are being disrupted because the ground's thawing later, potentially. And so it's kind of this paradoxical impact, and that's one of the things we see quite often with climate change, is that sometimes it's really straightforward, but sometimes it's not, and it even can be counterintuitive. One of the things that we see in New Jersey just about more than anywhere else is increased sea level rise. New Jersey, for a number of reasons, has greater rate of sea level rise than just about anywhere on the East Coast, and it's a significant difference. In Delaware Bay, the ground is subsiding at the same time that the seas are rising, and so a lot of along the Delaware Bay shore in New Jersey and Cape May and Cumberland counties, you'll see remnants of towns. If you look at maps from local maps from 100 years ago, where streets and thriving little villages once were, are now underwater and under the incoming tide regularly. Reed's Beach, of course, you see so many of those houses impacted just from the general tides, and the community has had to be resilient and had to adapt, as have so many others along the Cape May and Delaware Bay shoreline. And so this also has impacts for wildlife. Rising seas uh, can ultimately uh, wipe out entire suites of species. But again, it's never as simple as just that. In the short term, some of the impacts are actually positive ones for some of our beach nesting birds. You see on the top right that adorable young piping plover chick, and bottom left American oyster catchers. They're two of our handful of beach nesting bird species. And in the short term, some of the impacts from sea level rise are not bad ones for them. For instance, as some of the higher tides might clear some of the plants and give more open spaces that these beach nesting birds depend on to build their nests. So short term, that's great for them. Uh, and the negative is, though, as they continue to rise, what might be passing events that keep the beaches ideal for them soon become steady water covering those areas entirely, which are certainly not ideal. And that doesn't even get into the big impacts of major storms in and of themselves, which, when timed uh, poorly, can wipe out entire seasons for some of these birds. So it's kind of a hit or miss. Long term, probably headed more towards a miss for a lot of these species. Um, i- Moving a little bit inland on the other side of many of our barrier beaches, the salt marsh is also being impacted by that sea level rise. And what you're getting is a number of species, diamondback terrapins, that have shown good signs of recovering, even though there's so many threats to them these days. You still can see them quite commonly on many of our in many of our salt marshes, and walking along many of our causeways during late spring, our coastal causeways. Um, they certainly are at risk as the water gets higher in the marshes. The storms in particular can wash away their nests. Salt marsh sparrow, we're losing roughly 10% a decade of their population. Again, for those same impacts, as the water starts to inundate the marsh, we're losing so much salt marsh. And as much as we're losing in New Jersey, and other parts of the country are losing even far more. Places like Louisiana, of course, just losing, absolutely unthinkable amounts of salt marsh and all the incredible wildlife that depends on these essentially nurseries of the sea and of the wildlife kingdom. Another threat for diamondback terrapins, I should mention too, in addition to the higher levels of the water for the salt, kind of washing over the salt marshes, and ultimately, in long over time, drowning them because they can't keep up with this escalated change of sea level rise. The warmer air temperatures also can play tricks on diamondback terrapins. Terrapins, like many turtles, um, it's determined, male or female is determined by the temperature. And when the temperature reaches a certain point, all of a sudden, uh, it will skew the turtles in much greater direction. For instance, all female. And as long as it's kind of hovering in that general area, you'll get that mix that they need. But if it's to reach a point where it's no longer in that kind of borderline area, but significantly above it, then it can be almost all female, as an example. In which case, that would have massive ramifications for the overall population. Another impact from along our coasts, and particularly in Cape May, you'll see, is the saltwater intrusion. And so we've talked about what the water sea level rise does to the beaches, what it does to the salt marshes, but even going a little bit inland, as the sea level gets higher, it'll inundate freshwater environments, and that has major impacts on birds like the American bittern, the bottom left, great blue heron, and snowy egret. These are creatures that depend on the prey that they can find in these freshwater environments. As they become inundated with salt water, that can wipe out that prey, and thus impact the birds and other wildlife that depend on them. The tiger salamander on the top there, that incredible creature, it's found in such a small number of, really around a dozen plus populations, mostly in Cape May County, and it's found in so few places. But they tend to be very highly at risk to saltwater intrusion. And so, as a result, one of the projects our organization has done in recent years was to help build vernal pools, those freshwater ponds that salamanders depend on, and frogs and many other species depend on, to lay their eggs safely, because there's no fish, there's no salt water. It's kind of an ideal environment. They're temporary ponds. That's why there's no fish. They basically dry up part of each year. We've started to try to build them in places that are higher enough elevated that they're not going to be inundated by salt water, as many of them now are at risk of being. So yet another kind of nuanced impact that would certainly not be one of the first threats you would think of. Bottom right, you see the American sturgeon. These are the American and short-nosed sturgeon are two incredibly endangered species, and like the horseshoe crab, they predate the dinosaurs. These have been swimming in our along our waterways for time immemorial, and they can grow up to 14 feet, the size of a mid-sized car, massive fish, very prehistoric looking as well. And they have to swim up some of our coastal rivers, like the Delaware River, to reach a point where the saltwater content is not nearly as much as is basically within a range they can handle to spawn. Um, but as sea level rises and the other changes we're seeing, that point becomes further and further north, and and thanks to dams and other kind of obstructions, in many cases, the sturgeon soon could run out of places where they would be able to spawn. And so again, this is a creature that has lasted through eons, and it would be a shame for something as seemingly insignificant as a couple degrees shift to ultimately be the end cause of losing these entirely. And one other note with sturgeon, for those of you in our COVID times, if you're ever wondering if you're too close to the person in front of you as you're waiting in line at the checkout counter, just picture a sturgeon, an adult sturgeon, ideally a 26-year-old sturgeon. Just you picture that in your head, because that's around 6 feet long. And then you say, as long as you can picture that sturgeon there, you know you're good. So just a helpful tip. I know that's really helped me out as I wait at the ShopRite. Um, our oceans have seen drastic changes, even more than on land in many ways, due to climate change. The ocean, you're seeing temperatures really have increased in many ways, double in the Arctic as well. In many cases, double the impacts, twice what they are on land in many ways. We've seen it in the fish that basically that our fishing industry depends on, and that we see off our coast. So just a few decades ago, you would have seen much more fish like the halibut, the bottom left, whiting or hake, a much smaller species that you would find, lobsters, a lot of our clams, all of these fish and crustaceans and other marine creatures that you would find a few decades ago and that our fishing industry depended on here, winter flounder, another one, have moved up. And so you may still find them a little bit here, but not enough to support the fishing focus. And a lot of them now have moved off of the Massachusetts coast. You see them in places like the Grand Banks. And this is just in a few decades. And conversely, you've seen fish like the summer flounder moving north into our waters. So it's a bit of a trade-off, certainly. It's not like we just lost them and didn't replace them. We are replacing them, but the long-term trend is a worrying one, because the more these are impacted, ultimately we don't know, all those other impacts that will come about from these initial ones. So for now, though, we know we're seeing this major shift northward in a lot of those species. Sea turtles are another one, like the diamondback terrapins I mentioned earlier. Sea turtles are in their nesting days, which don't occur here in New Jersey. In their nesting times, they occur further south. They also depend on a certain temperature range, so they're at risk in that way. Another paradoxical way that they're at risk is many of our sea turtles, like this leatherback here, they swim further north. The temperature has gotten warmer in the waters, and so they swim further north than they might have. The problem is, though, when the temperature does turn cold, they're so far north that in many cases they're not able to get back south enough to beat that early winter waters. I mean, we saw that even last week. We had a sea turtle wash up in Edgartown, Massachusetts. We see in recent years off of Cape Cod, we've gone from in the mid 70s seeing roughly a handful, maybe a dozen sea turtles a year washed up in the winter. Uh, and it doesn't mean dead; they could have been injured. It depends, but basically stunned from the cold water, or otherwise attacked or by a secret, a shark or something else. We might have seen a dozen in the mid to late 70s. Uh, in the last couple of years, we're seeing over 1,000 in some years, and so the increase has been phenomenal. And again, you would think, well, how does warmer water lead to more cold water stunned turtles? But that's how they in a sense are invited too far north. And so I've talked a lot about these impacts to such a wide range of species. What's Of course, like I mentioned with the fish, though, it's not like we're losing some of them and not replacing them. We are replacing them, but it's not necessarily with species that will bring a rich biodiversity. What we're seeing is with climate change, the species that benefit most are the generalists, the invaders, those species that can handle anything because they've evolved in such a way hand in hand with modern civilization. So those white-tailed deer and those Canada geese that present those their threats in so many different ways. Even if you like seeing a deer, and they are beautiful animals, and seeing one in a natural habitat can always be a nice experience. But the damage they do to our on our roadways, the threat they pose to human lives from car accidents, of course, the damage to our crops and gardens, and then the incredible damage they do to our forests. They when they're in such great numbers and uncontrolled, they essentially can eat the entire understory of a forest, and so you have basically this cavernous forest growing with nothing underneath. It's kind of like the tall trees, the leaves up top, the canopy, and then almost this wasteland underneath. So very big threats ecologically. Canada geese, of course, uh, again, like white-tailed deer, are native species, but yet they've evolved in such a way that they've become a major threat. Um, in the case of Canada geese, crowding out other birds, fouling many of our ponds and parklands, and and essentially just almost creating their own monoculture in so many of our areas, particularly our suburban areas. And of course, European starlings, in this case, a true invasive species, brought in by a collector to Central Park 100 years ago because they were mentioned in a Shakespeare play, and since then they've made themselves quite at home. But so many of our most common species are invasive or acting in a sense as invasive, as we see with the Canada geese and the deer. And in the waters, it's no different. Jellyfish, we've seen a tremendous explosion in the last couple decades as the water warms, as the impacts of nitrogen runoff and all the fertilizers we use and all the development runs into the our bays and our coastal waters. Um, Jellyfish are one of the groups that can thrive the most, and that's exactly the kind of the kind of species that can handle climate change, because they've in a sense already evolved tolerance of so many of those most human impacts. And so climate change exacerbating that, they're well suited, whereas a lot of those fish species or other marine organisms that are not as well suited, they're at risk as those little changes start to add up. Well, and what does this mean for people, all these wildlife impacts? For someone who's not a particularly big wildlife fan, they might say, well, that's too bad, but, what does it really matter to us? The reality is it matters quite a bit. I mentioned with the pollinators earlier, 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat is thanks to a pollinator. So when you have your breakfast, you have your fresh fruit, you have a glass of orange juice, a cup of coffee. And it's a very healthy breakfast, by the way. But even if you have cereal, all the grains, and even if you have some kind of meat, that's also indirectly, the cattle and other livestock is often dependent on alfalfa or other pollinator uh, produced grains. And so the pollinators really are an irreplaceable part of our diet. Um, the bats and birds keep insect pests to a manageable number. And you see in the bottom left, when you start to lose the good numbers of the bats and the birds that keep that balance, you get much greater insect infestations and outbreaks of crop damage. You also, in turn, use more fertilizer to try to control that crop damage, and so it becomes this kind of escalating cycle. In our waterways, it's no different. We've seen a lot of our clamming industry move further north, even though you can still do it in New Jersey. The scale of it is quite different. You see with a lot of our shellfish, you're seeing again that move north, and with fishing, it's changed as well. The long-term risk to many of these industries is quite significant. Um, Likewise, even things like ecotourism, bird watching, there's always, these are dependent on healthy ecosystems and on really protecting what we have and educating people on what we have, and commercially as well. Fishing in New Jersey is such a huge, a huge industry and a huge passion for so many people, and it's vital that we protect and try to maintain, to whatever extent possible, a nice diversity of fish species, and to give the opportunity for people to, and for each generation to kind of have that chance here in New Jersey. Interestingly, bringing it kind of full circle from our first story about horseshoe crabs and red knots, you look in the top right, horseshoe crabs are important for their own. So you look at it as kind of like in three ways. Well, they're important because they're a species that has survived since the pre-dinosaur days, and so in their own right, they're important for that reason. But if we take it a step further, they're also important because you have all those shorebirds, including endangered ones, that just depend on horseshoe crabs during those spring migration. But then they're really important for a third reason, and this year of all years, we're kind of being reminded of that, is horseshoe crabs have a component in their blood called lysate. It's completely unique in the animal kingdom, which certainly reflects their uniqueness as a creature like nothing else. And this component is the only thing that can be used to test our medical, many of our medical injectable medicines, our devices, um, basically to make sure there's no harmful bacteria. So all of our major medicines in those ways have gone through this testing by lysate, by horseshoe crab blood. And in the year of COVID-19, it's a reminder too that every potential fix and solution for the COVID pandemic is ultimately going to be dependent on being tested by horseshoe crab blood. And so it's just something interesting to know for if maybe you have a friend or family member or colleague who kind of dismisses, well, what does really matter if what happens with any given wildlife species? It's what's the big deal, or what's the big deal if the temperature goes up another degree? Well, the horseshoe crab gives a great example of what's at stake and how it goes so far beyond what we typically might think of in our day-to-day existence, how much it can impact us, even for those people who don't particularly care about a given animal. It really can impact us in ways we might not have ever imagined. And it certainly impacts the natural ecosystems all around us. And those are, in ways that they're completely irreplaceable. I want to leave you with some, what I'll call good news, but really just some, examples of species that have come to New Jersey uh, over the years, in large part because of the warming temperatures. Black vultures you used to never see north of Cape May just a few decades ago. Now you see them statewide. They've moved farther north because of climate change. Brown pelicans, I know a few decades ago, growing up along the Jersey Shore, they would be a real rarity of a sighting. Now you can see them most summers in decent numbers throughout the summer. They've certainly come further north. Summer flounder has come further north as winter flounder has moved more out of our range. No, we don't have armadillos in our in our state as of yet, wild armadillos. But according to National Geographic, around 2040s to 2050, we should start to see them. They've been moving up a little northeast each year from their kind of more common grounds in Arkansas and Oklahoma and Texas. And they're making their way up. We can expect to see them in a few decades. I hear they're really tough on gardens, so I'm just giving you a heads up. Put that in your calendar. Save the date for the armadillo's arrival. One other bit of what I would say, trying to find a silver lining in the pandemic and all the challenges that we're going through right now, is it has, if we can take any lessons from the pandemic and use them in our fight against climate change and our fight to be as prepared as we can be. We've seen that when needed, just a few weeks of scaling back many of our fossil fuel emissions can have a massive difference. You see an example here in China, certainly in Los Angeles. You saw similar examples where what had always been filled with smog were suddenly clear skies. So it's always positive to see that it can be done. In this case, you know, the key with climate change would be the resolve to get it done, and it's certainly my hope that that we can start to make progress where we've really been stagnant for so long. Along those lines, well, what can you do to help with wildlife and also with climate change? One of them, of course, is hopefully you just voted in the last election, but beyond that, advocating for strong policies and legislation, making sure elected officials are considering some of these issues when it comes to policies that may impact wildlife or have an impact on climate change. Getting out and volunteering when it's safe to do so right now is challenging. I know we've had to scale back most of our volunteer opportunities, but certainly when that is safe or certain roles that can be, I strongly encourage you to consider volunteering for any group that works with wildlife, whether it's Conserve Wildlife Foundation or others, or that works with environmental issues like climate change. In your own yard, and this, we don't have to wait for the pandemic to get under control to do some of this, especially for the coming spring. Native plantings, planting native species goes a long way. It helps all those pollinators we talked about. Putting up bird feeders or bird nesting boxes or bat boxes also is huge right now. It's huge anytime, but especially in a time like this where you can make a difference in your own yard or maybe at your church or your community center or your school. This goes a long way. And lastly, supporting in whatever way you can groups like Conserve Wildlife Foundation that are doing work that you feel is important. Here's a final tip, not necessarily having much to do with climate change, but just in case you're interested this winter, keep an eye out for our wildlife webcams. We have free wildlife webcams for peregrine falcons, the fastest animal on earth. We have 2 cams up in North Jersey. For ospreys in Barnegat Light and Long Beach Island, we have an osprey cam and a bald eagle cam that we partner with Duke Farms on. And we're also considering other cams as well. These are cams where they're free. You can find them through our website, and they operate throughout the nesting season 24/7. They have sound as well, so you can really immerse yourself in this bird's eye view. It's pretty incredible, and even now you can see highlights from other years. So there's plenty of footage out there. And here's our website to learn more. Certainly to enjoy our webcams, but also to learn more about our work and all the wildlife that we work to protect, including we have detailed field guides for many of the species we talked about today. And with that, I thank you so much for joining me today, and I thank Cape May County Libraries as well for hosting this. Take care and have a good night.